Validating the Nagual. In the months following our first encounter, my commitment to Carlos stayed on the level of attending his lectures and reading his books. But it didn't take long before the magic of his teachings began to attract me with a force of its own. This situation confronted me with a choice, which I suppose presents itself to every apprentice of Nagualism. On the one hand, I could analyze the strange ideas of sorcerers in the light of academic knowledge, assimilating only what I could understand and verify. On the other hand, there was always the possibility of accepting Carlos's words to the letter, provisionally suspending my prejudices until I could work out a framework of my own, supported by experience. When I told him about my dilemma, he was happy and told me the two options I had considered had one important thing in common: practice. So it didn't matter which one of them I would adopt, as long as I was inflexible in my conclusions. I tried to elicit some explanations from him that might serve as a point of support in my mind and enable me to accommodate his postulates. But he interrupted me with a gesture. A warrior is not ahead of knowledge, he told me. He doesn't make inquiries out of habit, nor does he succumb to the sense of not understanding. When he wants to know something, he experiences it. I made him notice that the word experience had a very different meaning according to who pronounced it. For him, it meant a way of facing life. For me, the need to understand a phenomenon on an intellectual level. I thought I saw Carlos repressing an ironic smile. In a very kind tone, he explained that the knowledge and exercises of sorcerers are not by themselves difficult to understand or to practice. What makes them seem crazy is the fact that they were designed by a culture alien to us and for people with a different understanding of the world. He attributed my initial distrust to my rational configuration, not to any impediment of energy. He added that modern science has not been able to penetrate the Toltec knowledge because it has no appropriate methodology, not because the principles of sorcerers and scientists are intrinsically incompatible. In spite of all their good intentions, researchers are unable to move their assemblage points on their own. That being the case, how could they understand what sorcerers say? The lack of energy is a serious barrier between ordinary man and sorcerers, because without the necessary power, corroboration of the phenomena of sorcery is impossible. It is as if two people are trying to communicate in different languages. In general, sorcerers lose in that kind of exchange. In other times, people were threatened into believing they would lose their soul if they listened to the sorcerer. Today, modern man is indoctrinated to believe that this vision is unscientific. The truth is something else. Practicing the warrior's principles, far from damaging our mental clarity, gives us valuable tools with which to manage knowledge. That is because these principles, when they are guided toward accumulating energy, zealously follow two scientific postulates: experience and verification. Contrary to what many think, the need to corroborate is not exclusive to Western culture. It is also an imperative in the Toltec tradition. Nahualism, as an ideological system, is not based on dogmas, but on the personal experience of generations of practitioners. It would be absurd to think that all those people, over thousands of years, have placed their trust in simple lies. Since its starting point is experimentation, we can say that Nahualism is not a belief system, but a science. This statement was too much for me. Certain topics in Carlos's teachings had an undeniable practical value. For example, his constant advice to control self-importance, to acquire a clear vision of the privilege of living in this instant, and to adopt the strategic principles of the warrior's way. However, Other points of his conversations went beyond my capacity to understand. I simply could not accept that, in a parallel space to this world, a universe of laws that has nothing to do with our daily logic exists, populated by conscious entities that my senses cannot perceive. From the expression on my face, Carlos no doubt realized that I didn't entirely agree with what he had said, because he added, "For you, to corroborate is to explain, while for sorcerers it is to witness indescribable things without subterfuge or mental tricks. You believe that the reach of your senses is the real limit of the universe, but you don't stop to think that your senses are very poorly trained. I am inviting you not to believe, but to see. And I assure you that seeing is sufficient proof of everything I have told you. However, I cannot attest the energetic essence of the world for you. That you have to intend on your own, and to find inside your innate potentialities the way of carrying it out. What differentiates a contemporary scientist from a seer is that for the former, what's at stake is his own life. For the latter, the only thing he stands to lose if something goes wrong is his investigations, is his time. In his investigations is his time. The methods of both are equally rigorous, but different. A sorcerer cannot be satisfied if he can't verify for himself the stories he has been told. Just as there are degrees and levels of scientific instruction, the sorcery apprentice soon discovers that there are certain very defined stages in the increase of his perception, and he won't rest until he reaches them, or will perish in the attempt. So, as a method of investigation, Nagualism is totally reliable. My instructor showed me that the mark of the new seers is their capacity to synthesize. They are abstract sorcerers. Carlos put great emphasis on this term, accentuating each syllable. In fact, their focus is more rigorous than the focus of science, because seers are involved in an enterprise of colossal magnitude, which men of science don't even dare to formulate: the verification of our interpretation of the consensual reality in which we live. With that as a starting point, you can see how sorcery is the best ally of formal thought. Someday, it will be possible to break the ice, and science will discover that it shares a great vocation with Nagualism, a passion for truth. Then both modalities of investigation will shake hands and cease being antagonistic points of view. They will fuse into one intent to penetrate the mystery. While we said goodbye, I remarked to Carlos that his statements were completely opposite to the view that most people have on the topic of sorcery. He shrugged, as if to say, "And what does that matter?" Return to the essence. After practicing for a while, Carlos's teachings began to leave an imprint in me. What was mistrust at the beginning soon became an astonished verification of states of awareness beyond my mental parameters. Suddenly, I was possessed by an urgent need to understand, although not with my reason, but with the totality of my body. I came to a point where the foundations of my everyday existence finally crumbled, and it became evident to me that the perception of sorcerers contains universes of experience, which, until then, I hadn't had the slightest awareness of. During this whole process, I went through an intense identity crisis, behaving as a daring and unprejudiced investigator at one moment, at the next moment turning into the epitome of mental resistance. I realized that these emotional fluctuations had to do with Carlos's conversations. After listening to him, I would spend weeks in feverish activity, attempting dreaming and practicing all the techniques I had heard or read about. But little by little, my initial enthusiasm cooled down, and I would return to the uncomfortable feeling of not understanding anything. Faced with the chaos of new sensations which began to saturate me, I discovered that I only had one defense: reason. More than ever, I tried to convince myself that ultimately, only the things which can be fully explained can be true. In spite of everything Carlos had noted about how deceptive reason can be, I was willing to tolerate this point only if I myself witnessed some prodigious act that truly challenged natural laws. That morning, we had an appointment in a restaurant in front of the hotel where he stayed. We were alone in the room, apart from a shoe shiner who nodded in a corner and the waiter who looked at us with an air of boredom. Judging that this was an appropriate moment, I asked, "Can you prove your teachings to me with some act of power?" He looked at me with astonishment, as if he had expected anything but this, and took some seconds to answer me. "Unfortunately," he said, "I cannot prove anything to your mind. It's too far gone. To validate the Nagual, you need free energy. And for that, the only source I know of is impeccability. In the world of energy, everything has its price, so it depends on you. I cannot silence your mind, but you can, and thus verify what I'm telling you for yourself." I asked him what I could do with the doubts which inevitably arose in my mind. He answered, "Uncertainty is the natural state of victims. On the other hand, trust and audacity are the characteristics of predators. You decide. The main thing is that you realize that there are no such thing as the teachings of Castaneda. I just try to be direct and to act from my silence a course of action which I recommend for you, because it does away with madness. I am not a powerful Nagual like Don Juan, nor am I your benefactor, but I've been a witness to acts that would leave you speechless with surprise, and I don't mind at all telling you about it. It's just that those stories won't tell you anything unless you lower your guard and allow them to penetrate you. If you want to verify the tales of power, you have to open up to experience. Don't shield yourself behind your interpretations, because in spite of all our studies as modern, ordinary men, we know very little about the world. You, like any other sorcery apprentice, have an enormous training field. For example, your emotional ups and downs, your energy drainages. Plug them, and you will see how things change. Those 8 hours you spend every night like a vegetable without realizing anything. Explore them, take control, and dare to be a witness. If you elucidate the secrets of your dreams, in the end you will see what I see, and there won't be any more doubts in your mind." We remained silent for a moment while our plates were served. Carlos interrupted the silence. "Remember, doubts are just mental noise, nothing very deep." I replied that according to what little I had learned in my passage through life, doubt is the base of all true knowledge. But he had a different theory. He argued, "So much time is spent accumulating stuff that it becomes very difficult to accept anything new. We are willing to waste years of our life filling out forms or discussing with friends. But if someone tells us the world is unique and full of magic, we feel distrust, and we run to take refuge in our catalog of preconceived ideas. On the other hand, a predator fights all his life to perfect his hunting techniques. always keeps his sense of opportunity alert and is never confused by the appearance of things. He is cautious and patient. He knows that his prey may jump out from any bush, and that the smallest hesitation can be the difference between continuing to live or perishing. He carries no doubts. A warrior is a hunter, not a cynical opportunist. Either he fully accepts the challenge of knowledge with all that it involves, or his own achievements will regress him to a more awful condition than that of an ordinary man. I felt that his words contained a veiled reproach. I tried to justify myself, but he interrupted me. It is obvious that you have been practicing. In those circumstances, your mind is disturbed. But the pain of your worrying will disappear as soon as you recognize that what you worry about is an implanted doubt. Like all of us, you have been trained to pass all the information you receive through the filter of reason. You remind me of a dog that lived in a senior citizen's home. When somebody, out of pity, threw him some crumb, he got so excited that he couldn't enjoy it calmly anymore. You are just like that. You are so grateful to your science that you think you owe it something, that you cannot be unfaithful to it. You don't dare to dream. You cannot enjoy the magical side of the world. You have given yourself much too deceptive a parameter for your verifications. Reason. What I propose is that you replace that approach with another, more reliable, and above all, much wider one. Sanity. I have already explained to you that sorcerers claim there is a radical difference between the two concepts. To understand it better, think, for example, about the history of the world. Most of it was made by very sane people who nevertheless dared to challenge commonly held beliefs. They were opposed to what seemed reasonable at that time. If you travel beyond our world, you will see that it is the same there. The universe is not reasonable, but it can be faced with energy and sanity. When you learn how to use it, then you understand it in a basic way, without words. Who needs words when one is a witness? I agree with you in that, from an everyday point of view, concepts of sorcery are completely senseless. But there is a deep dimension to our awareness where the complaints of the mind don't penetrate, and a warrior won't rest until he finds it. Once there, he discovers that his own reason, when it is exercised with inflexible rigor and in its entirety, will automatically lead to sorcery, because the essence of reason is sobriety, indifference, and non-pity. Once he is the owner of his reason and no longer manipulated by it, a sorcerer can attempt the feat of speech, putting into words the unfathomable enigma of existence. But that is such a difficult art that you can approach it only by means of a great energy surplus. To be a warrior is an endless fight to be impeccable. The trick of sorcerers is that they know that the energy we invest in enslaving ourselves is the same energy that can liberate us. We just have to rechannel it, and the tales of power will begin to materialize in front of our eyes. Therefore, don't fight against your uncertainty. Go with it. Use it as a stimulus for verification and put it to the service of your energy needs. Verify everything. Don't let a tale of power remain in the domain of myths. Commit yourself intimately to knowledge, but commit as a warrior, not as a slave of reason. He pointed out an Indian girl who was passing by down the street with a boy of 9 months or so tied to her back. The face of the child radiated an insatiable curiosity, spilling and bubbling out of his black, round eyes, which were like small obsidian mirrors, eagerly looking at everything. Carlos continued, "The warrior's commitment with the spirit consists of a return to our original nature. It is a pact we all seal by the simple fact of having been born. Man is born with the impulse to witness everything, but it is brutally mutilated during the first years, and so we must rediscover it. You have to clean your concern of all prejudice and return to that boy's pure curiosity. A warrior is forced to verify all the knowledge that arrives at his door, to experience it in full, no matter where it comes from. And then he has to have the necessary discerning ability to select and keep what is useful. Should I also apply that discerning ability to the path you preach?" He seemed bothered by my question and replied in a firm tone, "I have already told you that there is no Castanedan way, just as there is no Buddha's way, nor one of Jesus Christ. Haven't you understood yet that teachers are not necessary? I'm not selling you merchandise. I don't care if you agree with me. I am only pointing out the address to you out of sheer impersonal affection. Go and verify it, if that is what you want, and if not, keep your doubts." When we said goodbye, Carlos told me, "You should not pay too much attention to your worries. They are symptomatic. Something in your interior is giving in, and it is normal for your human form to defend itself. Very soon your dealings with the Nagual will make you shake in your boots, and you will need your sanity like never before. Maybe you will regret ever having asked me for a sign." I believe because I want to. It's difficult for me to write about such a personal concept as the verification of the postulates of sorcerers. Being able to agree with them was a matter of not of arriving at coherent explanations, but of being involved in a minimum of practical commitments and building a new kind of consensus from there. The elements of that new language, the true dialogue of warriors, are not founded in our reason, but in our energy savings. As Carlos explained to me, the validation of such an irrational topic as the movement of the assemblage point can be done only via premises of power. Since any intent to explain something is a product of the fixation of the assemblage point in a specific position, there is no other way to corroborate its movement than to move it for ourselves and see what happens. Faced with the overwhelming logic of his argument, I asked him, "Does that mean that it's not possible to verify the statements of sorcerers from the outside?" "On the contrary," he answered, "the effects of power can only be lived from the outside, because once our attention flows, we stop being a rigid and isolated me, and instead we blend into the world that surrounds us. That's why seers say that the mystery of the world is not inside, but outside. Or in other words, the solution is not mental, it is practical. I asked him what was practical about a topic as vague as the movement of the assemblage point. He replied that the movement was something vague for me because I didn't have any voluntary control over my state of awareness. As an example, he mentioned learning how to read and write, something that may seem completely unimportant to a savage, but ends up becoming a vital necessity for civilized man. And that example, he said, could only give a bleak idea of how urgent the control of the assemblage point becomes for a sorcerer. I wanted to know how a topic of such importance could go unnoticed in the life of the immense majority of people. He answered that the movement of the assemblage point is something as natural and at the same time as sophisticated as speaking or thinking. If we are not taught how to do it, we never do it. He assured me that the key to either reading or losing the extraordinary achievements of sorcery resides in consensus, in the agreements we make. To verify facts, one first has to agree on their meaning. Unfortunately, for most people to agree means to be rigid and not depart from the official description. We must have a strong will to learn if we are to dare exploring other areas of consent. Sorcerers have found that there are two ways of agreeing. The first one is the collective consensus. It starts from reason, and it can take you very far, but it will inevitably throw you into a paradox in the end. The other is the consensus induced by a movement of the assemblage point, and it can be corroborated only by those that share similar circumstances. A consensus based on individual experience has an advantage over one based on explanations, because the life of the senses is complete in itself. Reason, on the other hand, only works by means of comparisons, positive and negative, certain or false, and so on. The first effect of penetrating the consensus of sorcerers is that those dualities we have always accepted as something self-evident stop being operative, which at first is extremely disconcerting for the reason. In time, sorcerers learn that in a world where there are no solid objects, but rather beings who flow among various states of awareness, it doesn't make sense to try to separate truth from lies. Don Juan said that the truth is like the cornerstone of a building. A sensible man should not try to remove it. When we surrender to definitions, our energy becomes stagnated or blocked. The tendency to do that is an imposition of the foreign mind, and we have to put an end to it. To replace the reason-based consensus with experience was what Don Juan called to believe without believing. For sorcerers, this completely redefines the concept of corroboration. They look not for definitions, but for results. If a practice can elevate our level of awareness, what does it matter how we explain it to ourselves? How we start acting to save and increase our energy is not important, because once we are in possession of our totality, we enter a new field of attention where we don't care about concepts anymore, and things demonstrate themselves. Perhaps you think that these statements just give permission to be irresponsible, but a warrior understands the real message. Reality is a doing, and a doing is measured by its fruits. Anyone who judges a sorcerer from an everyday point of view will judge him to be an irremediable liar, because the universes of both don't coincide. And if the sorcerer tries to explain inexplicable things with borrowed words, he will inevitably become entangled in contradictions and be seen as a humbug or a lunatic. That's why I have said that from the point of view of the everyday world, the world of the Nagual is a fraud. In fact, this goes for all isms. Nagualism is not an exception, but as opposed to the defenders of reason, who seek followers for their particular kind of agreement. A sorcerer won't tell you that his vision of the world is the real one. He tells you, I believe because I want to, and you can do it too. This expression of will is something very powerful and will provoke, as an avalanche, events of power. If you pay close attention, you will notice that children don't just innocently believe in the magic of the world. They believe because they are complete and they see. And the same thing happens with sorcerers. The fabulous stories I have told you don't belong to the plane of reality in which you and I are having this conversation. But they happened. Nagualism is like somebody who inherited a story and a treasure map, but doesn't believe in it. So he comes to you and gives his secret to you. And you are so clever or so naive that you take the story as truth and dedicate yourself to deciphering the map. But the map is coded with various keys, which makes you learn several languages, go to difficult places, dig in the ground, climb mountains, descend into ravines, and dive in deep waters. After years of searching, you arrive where the treasure should be. And, oh, how disappointing, you just find a mirror. Was it a lie? Well, you are healthy, strong, well-educated, full of adventures, and you've had a great experience. Truly, there was a treasure there. Keeping in mind that there are neither truths nor lies in the flow of energy, a warrior chooses to believe by predilection for the excitement of the adventure. And in this way, he learns to focus on the world from another point of view, the focus of silence. It is only then that the immense treasure of the teachings is revealed. A new stage of knowledge. When the presentation of his new book ended, we left and walked along Insurgentes Avenue. Insurgentes Avenue. It was night, a little cold and surprisingly clear. The air smelled clean. While we walked, Carlos commented that what he didn't like about that kind of activity was meeting so many sycophants, and the fact that they forced him to toast with champagne. His technique was to keep one full glass during the whole event without having even one sip. That way, they stopped inviting him. He added that his literary career began with a challenge. One time, Don Juan put forward the proposal that in order to utilize the heaps of notes he had taken during his apprenticeship, he should write a book. In the beginning, I considered it a joke, since I was not a writer. However, Don Juan outlined it to me as a sorcery exercise. Once he had started, he began to take pleasure in the work and ended up understanding that for him, books were an avenue to his real mission as a Nagual. I asked him if he didn't fear that divulging the knowledge to all kinds of people would end up corrupting it. No, he answered. What degenerates knowledge is secrecy. Putting it within reach of people renews it. Nothing is more healthy for energy than fluency. And that concerns the knowledge of sorcerers most of all. We are temporary recipients of power. We are not entitled to retain it. Also, this knowledge only makes sense for those who practice it and achieve the necessary energy to corroborate it. The rest doesn't matter. I entered the world of the Nagual at the precise moment when a rupture was necessary. That forced me to face the most dramatic decision of my life, to publish the teachings. It has been very hard for me to be the representative of such a watershed. And for years I lived the trauma of not understanding what I was doing. There were people who even wrote me threatening letters in the name of tradition. The sorcerers of the old guard didn't want to lose their prerogatives. I told him how extraordinary I thought it was, that he should choose to break so drastically with the millennial tradition of secrecy. I didn't break anything, he replied. The command of the Spirit was clear. All I did was comply with it. In the beginning of my apprenticeship, I was prepared to take the reins of the lineage. One day everything changed. Warriors of the party saw that my energy structure was different from the Nagual Juan Matis' energy, and they interpreted it as a command with no possibility of appeal. As the rule dictates, they put in my hands the heavy responsibility of closing the lineage. For centuries, parties of warriors had acted as a sponge, absorbing experience to corroborate the sophisticated principles of the way of knowledge. The only exit left for me was to return that knowledge to the people. The cycle of my books is a beginning, a humble intent to put within reach of modern man fragments of a knowledge which was hidden for generations. The moment for corroborations will come later, and other cycles will follow. Because once the teachings of sorcerers come into the hands of the public, it is inevitable that some begin to question and experiment with perception, and in that way discover the entire potential of which we are capable. I asked him how Don Juan's and his cohorts had reacted when they realized that the secrets of the group were being disclosed. He answered, I have already described how on one occasion, when I brought a copy of one of my books to Don Juan, he returned it to me with a scornful comment. That is only half the truth. The fact is that he was the author of those texts. He didn't write them letter by letter, but he was in charge of the whole matter, and he supervised every one of my statements. In time, I discovered that Don Juan's strategy had been carefully calculated. The plan of the Nagual has supreme audacity and a brilliant simplicity. He introduced the knowledge of seers to the public, not to contribute to the grandeur of academia, but to elevate the level of awareness in the masses. And he presented it through the very institutions that might refute him. He knew that exposing the teachings through a mystic or religious format would not penetrate as deeply as a presentation with the support of a scientific guarantee. For that reason, he demanded that I shape my first book as a thesis for my degree. The operation of the Nagual Juan Matis initiated a new stage in the transmission of knowledge, an unprecedented stage. The secrets of the movement of the assemblage point have never been put within reach of the public before. The appointment is with dreaming. When I told him that I had been visiting certain groups based in the Mexican tradition in search of keys to ancient knowledge, Carlos took it as a joke and started to laugh. Seeing my disconcerted reaction, he asked me not to take his laughing personally. It was just that my investigations reminded him of his own actions when he came to Mexico as a student in search of information. He explained that according to Don Juan's teachings and what he himself had been able to discover, there are two kinds of tradition, the formal and the energetic. The one has nothing to do with the other. The formal tradition depends on secrets and the preservation of routines. It teaches allegories and produces shepherds and flocks. The energetic tradition deals with concrete achievements like seeing and moving the assemblage point. Its strength is renewal and experimentation, and it produces impeccable warriors. A warrior is devoted to his task. He doesn't waste his energy on following anybody. He doesn't care about social customs, whether they may be contemporary or represent millennia of tradition. Also, secrecy is not part of his stalking. I replied that, in my opinion, believing that an ancestral knowledge exists in various traditions on Earth is justified by the fact that techniques of manipulation of awareness cannot be imparted by means of books, but only from mouth to ear. The interaction with the teacher of wisdom has to be personal. He commented, "You read that somewhere, right?" We both laughed. He told me that truly useful knowledge is very simple, and it can be expressed in very few words. It is not necessary to make so much noise about it, and it doesn't matter how it is transmitted. If it is orally, well, great, but any other means will serve equally well. The important thing is to convince oneself that there is no time for foolishness, because death is at our heels. Beyond that truth, a warrior needs very little, because his sense of urgency will make him save energy, and his accumulated energy will allow him to discover his totality. I commented that according to what I had read, divulging secret knowledge is characteristic of black sorcerers. On the other hand, white sorcerers transmit what they know with restraint, because they are aware that knowledge involves a certain danger to those who are not prepared to receive it. Carlos shook his head with incredulity. "But what is going on with you?" he asked. "What destroys us is ignorance, not knowledge. There is nothing in the profundities of knowledge that can put man's authentic interests at risk. You started from an erroneous but very common idea that there are two kinds of knowledge, an outside one and an inside one. Seers, on the other hand, say that knowledge is one, and what does not bring you to freedom is not worthwhile. For them, the truth is the opposite of what you say. The dark sorcery of the ancients is secretive, while transparency is the characteristic of the new seers." "Then, Carlos, do you deny the existence of any initiated knowledge inside the Mexican tradition?" Instead of answering, Carlos demanded that I define the term initiated. This got me in trouble, since in fact I didn't have a very clear idea about this. Making an effort, I explained to him that initiates are people who, thanks to their merits, become recipients of a particular traditional knowledge the rest of their fellow men do not share. While I spoke, Carlos agreed gravely. When I finished, he commented, "That definition is a portrait of the importance you grant yourself." He maintained that classifying human beings for what they know is a mere arrangement of the collective inventory, something like making distinctions among a line of ants, because some are slightly darker than others. The ironic thing is that we human beings do in fact divide ourselves into two groups, those who dissipate their energy and those who conserve it. You can call the last ones whatever you want, sorcerers, Toltecs, initiated, and it's the same whether they have a teacher or not. Their luminous reality is such that they are a step away from freedom. What nobody can teach them, warriors obtain by themselves by listening to the silent commands of the Spirit. To open up to power is a natural process. No man can tell another, "You are already open," unless he is a charlatan. Nor are there any shortcuts that will automatically bring us to freedom. The secrets of initiation are symbols of the arrogance of the ancients. Keys without a door. They will get you nowhere. You can spend your life pursuing them, and when you finally obtain them, you'll discover you have nothing. You believe that what differentiates knowledge is the way it is transmitted, whether by books or by oral tradition. It has not occurred to you that both methods are the same, because both belong to our everyday agreements. What is important about the way you receive information? What matters is that you become convinced to act. The method of sorcerers is the systematic saving of energy. They state that what separates men is not what they know, but how much energy they possess. Therefore, the true way to transmit knowledge is in increased states of awareness. The appointment of sorcerers is not with a book or a ceremony, but with dreaming. When a warrior learns how to capture experience through his dreams, it doesn't matter under which label the teachings are presented, since his perception is pure and he can corroborate it with his seeing. Bringing the teachings to the masses. In another of our conversations, he told me that although they were antithetical, in many aspects antithetical, there was one thing neither the old nor the new seers questioned: the need to keep the knowledge hidden. They transformed the Toltec language into a forest of metaphors, where almost anything could be said with almost any combination of words. And it was also they who sank pre-Hispanic societies under an unbearable load of rituals, procedures, and secret passwords. Instead of strengthening sorcery, this weakened it. The heritage of secrecy still burdens some groups of knowledge, although I have tried to shake it. I asked him why sorcerers try to hide knowledge. He answered that each cycle of seers had their own reasons for doing it. The ancients started with an understanding that we are transitory, but they allowed themselves to become corrupted by seductive ideas of survival. As a result, they were filled with self-importance and lapsed into exclusivity. They were like the pyramids they built, as obvious and attractive as they were secretive and inaccessible. They preferred to keep themselves apart from the average people, whom they saw as unworthy and ignorant. But at the same time, they couldn't do without a court of followers. That contradiction caused long wars for control of the flock and destroyed a great deal of real knowledge. Self-importance and its unpleasant relatives, secrecy and exclusivity, feed on the fixation of the assemblage point. For that reason, the ancients had a great interest in generating rigid traditions. In order to achieve maximum stability at the core of their societies. In reality, their concern for the spirit was very mixed up with their ambitions for temporal power. The new seers discontinued all that by giving the fluidity of the assemblage point first priority. They had observed that as soon as that point moves, the idea of secrecy changes into idiocy. Because in the realm of energy, there are no rigid limits between conscious beings. In consequence, what became most important for them was to get rid of all speculation and emphasize the practical side of the path. However, they soon came into contact with a bitter reality. Ordinary people didn't understand them, but on the contrary, were afraid and tried to destroy them. The secrecy of the new seers was not motivated by the feelings of superiority that moved their predecessors, but was adopted for strategic reasons. They had to endure extreme persecution and were forced to protect themselves. It is an historical irony that in spite of the legitimacy of their motives, in time the strategy of the new seers has caused the same effects as the arrogance of the old ones. After centuries of secrecy, all their energy had gone into hiding their knowledge, and many ended up forgetting what it was they had hidden. At present, the modality of our time is changing quickly. In consequence, something else, which seemed immovable, is also changing. The way the teachings are transmitted. Naguals nowadays are forced to find new channels for the energy, even if it means to eradicate the most entrenched customs. Why is this change happening? Because circumstances have moved ahead of tradition. To maintain the knowledge hidden is no longer a vital demand. There are those who will criticize you for disclosing it, but nobody will kill for that reason today. So, to continue the practice of censoring portions of knowledge has become catastrophic for the total objective of sorcery, because those portions ferment inside us and serve as food to the deep-seated sense of importance. My first task as a Nagual was to put an end to the secrecy of my predecessors. The choice of modern warriors is freedom. Today, we can say whatever we want, giving our listeners the choice to take it or leave it. This has led to an extraordinary consequence, which previous Naguals could never enjoy: mass practicing. Mass practicing is our security valve. You can deceive people's minds, because after all, their minds are not their own. But you cannot confuse the luminous mass of hundreds or thousands of intents, focused collectively on the goal of freedom. Mass is energy, and energy allows us to break out of the stagnation of attention. Through collective practice of the magical passes, I have witnessed the true energetic manifestation around the world. Something that for the first time has allowed me to believe in the feasibility of my task. My cohorts and I are so excited with what is happening that we don't have words to describe it. The magical passes. For some years, Carlos had been teaching some movements to small groups that he called magical passes, because according to him, they served to prevent energy from stagnating and forming balls. The play of the drum was one of the passes, the arrow to the right and left, and the dynamo were among the others. He said Don Juan would practice them at any time of the day, wherever he happened to be. Mostly he would do them before or after carrying something, or when he had been in the same position for a long while. The matter interested me a lot, because I myself practiced some Oriental postures and was generally inclined toward physical exercises. Therefore, at the first opportunity that presented itself, I asked him where he had learned the magical passes. He answered, "They are the heritage of the ancient seers." At that time, he was not much seen in public, but little by little, his secrecy had become less rigid, and large groups of people began to approach him. As he began to teach the passes in public, Carlos began to change them somewhat, making them more complicated and dividing them into categories. He ended up giving them a name taken from architecture, tensegrity, which, he told us, was the combination of two terms, tension and integrity. From the very first, there were some detractors, resentful people who, without stopping to appreciate the practical side of these exercises, began to spread the word that the Nagual had just invented them. When I mentioned that I was worried about this, he was firm. Tensegrity is my intent. A Nagual has authority, and this is my gift to the world. Don Juan and his warriors taught their apprentices many specific movements which filled us with energy and well-being and helped free us from the yoke of the foreign mind. My role has been to modify them slightly, taking them out of the sphere of the personal and adapting them to people in general, so that they become useful to other groups of practitioners. He told me that the method he had chosen in the beginning of teaching the magical passes in a limited form was in certain ways a failure, since those who were moved to practice them were too few to accumulate enough energetic mass. So, in this new phase, he had created a system able to impact on the awareness of multitudes. My cohorts and I will open a great door in the energy. That fissure is so powerful that it will last for ages, and those who approach it to look inside will be swallowed to another world. With tensegrity, what I seek is to train those who are interested so that they can support that transition. Those who don't have enough discipline will perish in the intent. The plan of disclosing the teachings is the summary of 30 years of practices and experiments. As a man and as a Nagual, I have done as much as I have been able to do to make it work, because I know that the collective mass of many warriors can cause a commotion in the modality of our time. The end of the lineage. On various occasions, Carlos affirmed that Don Juan Matus's lineage ended with him. But when I wanted to know more about it, he insisted that for now he could not give me any more details. I can't know exactly what the design of power will be. Who am I to determine something like that? I know the traditional form of the lineage which I belong to ends with me. But whether a new format will continue into the future or not is something that is determined by a superior force. He told me he had spent years waiting for signs of continuity. Concretely, a person that had the luminous characteristics to be the new Nagual. But those signs didn't appear. Consequently, he had decided to act in an impeccable way, as if he were the last Nagual on earth. From that came his urgency to tell everything. Take advantage of me, he told me. I am liquidating all that was given to me. With sadness, I asked if it meant that after him there would be no more teaching of the knowledge. He answered, "No, that's not what I mean. My destiny is to close a line, nothing more. I am sure the Spirit will find the way of continuing ahead, because the current of knowledge cannot stop. The extinction of a lineage of sorcerers or the birth of another are constant incidents in the flow of energy. I know several parties of warriors living now, getting ready for the final jump. And I can also foresee the beginning of a new cycle, corresponding to the renewal of cultural paradigms for the next millennium.